we're fortunate in the sense that we've had a long association with foster+freeman, and I think originally there was probably a VSC 2000, which was before my time, but I started work at the Royal Philatelic Society in 2010 and got involved with their expert committee, and we have a VSC 6000, and I've used that successfully for quite a range of different things, including the one sent British Guiana, but other things like some of the items from the Queen's collection and other important items which the VSC is very useful to show whether things are fraudulently manipulated. I tend to have a challenge when I go into the Royal Philatelic Society to actually understand how potentially a fraud may have been occurred. We particularly have stamps whereby they've been cleaned. Quite often there's a big difference in the value between an unused stamp, a mint stamp, and a used stamp. And if the fraud is basically that they've cleaned the stamp and then potentially they may have put the gum back on the stamp, and it's very useful to use the VSC specifically to actually identify how that's been done, and then eventually we get back to the submitter and say, I'm sorry, it's not a £10,000 stamp, but it might be only worth £1,000 or maybe £100. But that's a very useful example of the VSC. Some of the ways that the fraud is manipulated in the sense of the colours, the whole way that you can potentially show the artists of maybe improving a stamp. This can basically mean actually adding bits of paper but painting it in. And so hopefully when you're able to look at some of the clips from the video, you can see things like the perforations have been filled in, the fact that the margins of a stamp which were missing have been added, and the fact that the coloration matches the existing colour of the stamp. It can be quite exciting and quite challenging to understand how that may have occurred. The machine is extremely good at detecting where fiscal cancellations, so these are basically stamps that have not been through the post, but they've been cleaned and then they've actually been had a cancellation of some sort put on them. That can be frustrating, challenging. The stamps also have various security features like watermarks. Sometimes they're not always easy to see. The main thing, of course, is to say that the VSC is not a destructive technique. When people submit their items, they hopefully will get back what they've submitted, and ideally, of course, with an opinion from the expert committee which shows that that item is genuine, or if there has been some form of fraudulent manipulation, that is actually described on the certificate which goes back to the submitter. So we're looking here at a Great British stamp. It's 2 shillings and 6pence, and it's from George VI. What makes this stamp interesting is it appears to have some holes in it. So if we use the feature to actually show what that is, it looks like it says GEC. So these stamps were produced for firms to send out their postal services, and the idea was that these so-called perfins provided some form of security that they could not be used by individuals without the permission of the owning firm. We're now going to have a look at another stamp which apparently doesn't seem to have any perfins in. And this stamp actually comes from, as you can read, the British South Africa Company. And this is a very interesting stamp because it says £20. And apparently, if we put the same illumination on as we've done for the other stamp, we might be slightly suspicious, but we can say that there isn't actually holes in the stamp. But let's look at it in a bit more detail. So as we enlarge this for further magnification, our suspicions are going to be raised by the fact that it looks like in the centre of the shield here that in fact, what's this? Some slightly different coloured circles which suggests that the actual perforations have been filled in. Now why would somebody want to do that? The short answer is, of course, money. And if this has been used through this type of mechanism, it might be worth, let's say, £100. If it's actually a mint version of this stamp, it could be worth £16,000. And if in the catalogues, if you look up, they don't actually list the fact that there is some form of, in this case, cancellation, which, if genuine, could potentially mean that it could be worth even more money. So if you happen to be a fraudster and wanting to try and persuade people that you have a very valuable rare stamp, here's a good example of somebody who's filled in the holes, and they've then actually been painting the comparable information which you can see on other parts of the stamp. A really interesting item and a classic forgery in its own way. So buyer beware if you're offered things like that. Here's a stamp which in this case happens to be £5, and very clearly it reads Rhodesia. It looks like it's actually never been used, but we're just going to test using the VSC 8000 to see whether in fact a cancel of some form has actually been removed.
Okay, so for a removal, we'll look to see if there's any traces of the ink remaining.
And I think immediately you discovered the fact.
I see something here. Yeah.
Obviously, during the life of different stamps and stamp companies, different ways were actually used to actually show that the stamp had actually been used. And in this case, what we are seeing is, in fact, there's a mark across the stamp which indicates that it has actually been used postally, and then somebody has decided that they will actually remove that, because invariably there's a difference between a mint stamp and a used stamp. So when we actually look up the actual value of this stamp, a stamp, if it was genuine, without the cancellation, would be worth approximately £10,000. With this cancellation on, it's worth approximately half that. So still quite a valuable stamp. But once it's obviously been fiddled around with, it will not get a good certificate.